Okay, thanks everybody for joining us today and taking time out of your day to join us for this sudo talk installation on updates and more. This sudo talk series is something we do regularly each month, just to kind of cover a depth of topics about Apple management and giving as much information as we can on that topic and how we're working on stuff on the back end here and how to make your lives a little bit easier with the product. My name is Bryce Carlson. I'm a product manager here at Addigy, and I'm joined today by Joelle and Nicholas. So our topic today, we're going to be talking about troubleshooting system updates and MDM as a whole. A little bit of an agenda for what we're going to be covering. So first, we're going to cover the system updates via MDM. What are they? How do they function on the back end? And why did they exist to begin with? Then we'll talk about the policy and inheritance of the settings for that and how that feature functions. Then Joelle's going to talk a little bit about how you can use flex policies and leverage those to assign and set your updates policies and settings more efficiently. Then Ponce and I are going to talk about identifying those troubled devices within the platform and actually getting into the platform. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding the root cause of how the updates can fail or if there's any issues that you do find with them and troubleshooting that. Then we'll talk about fixing those devices manually. Ponce will show some of the stuff that we have out there that you could do today in the product with that. Then I'm going to kind of talk about automating the device remediation, the device facts that exist out there for that, what we can utilize those with in monitoring. And then I'm also going to talk about MDM Watchdog, which is a public beta for a new feature that's out there just in the last few weeks to help automate that process even further to the point that it's set it and forget it, it's on as soon as the feature is enabled. Then we'll kind of wrap up with just some information about the rapid security response updates that came out just in the last few weeks here from Apple and how that works with the feature that we're talking about here today. Then we'll wrap with Q&A, any questions you guys have or things that we didn't get to by answering them during the webinar in the Q&A functionality there. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A feature within Zoom here while we're going. Each of us takes turns talking. We'll try and answer those as we go if there's any time to do that. And if not, we'll get to them in the Q&A session there. So with that, we'll get started on the system updates via MDM. What are they? Well, basically, it's the 4 platforms that exist in the Apple world, and those updates being installed via MDM commands that are pushed to the device to instruct it to go get that update from Apple. So that update's not coming from Addigy itself or the S3 bucket that those packages are stored in. It's actually going out and getting that from Apple's CDN. How does that work? Well, there's device channel MDM commands that are being sent to the device. There's going to be one that's going to list what are the available updates the device has. That's the information that we're taking in as an MDM to understand, okay, this device needs X Protect, it needs Safari, it needs macOS 13.x, whatever version. Then we also have a series of commands once we've interpreted what the device can get, that we're going to say, okay, go and get this update, go and install this. It's going to send out that device channel MDM command and say, go and install this product key, whatever those are. And then it's going to push that out with the options and different components that we're going to be talking about in the settings here in just a little bit. So why does it function that way? Why isn't it just a package? Why isn't it just the installer itself, the .app or something like that? Well, starting in 2020, Apple expanded to say, okay, we're going to start supporting macOS system updates via MDM with a lot more granularity. And then in 2021, they added even more to that protocol for the different changes, whether that be with the platform or different architecture changes like Intel Silicon that we have now seen now as well. So, and this is just a little blurb from one of Apple's KBs and different things that we'll be talking about. But basically, Big Sur and later has these new ways to manage this, and it's going to be replacing the previous versions of that offering, and it's going to be providing you with more control. And really what that means is it's because of all these changes with the platform, with Silicon, with Secure Boot, with T2, all of that, with authenticated restart, that these Bootstrap token too. These updates need to run in this blessed and anointed fashion. And so doing them via MDM and sending the commands out that way is the way that we're going to get those on the device and get them to run and kick that off and have a little bit of control over that. So what does that look like in the product? And we'll be actually getting in there in just a second to talk about that and Flex. But basically, if you're going to go out to any of your policy, parent or child, and you're going to go into the update section and then the system updates tab, you're going to see the different platforms there, the different settings. If you haven't already been in here, basically, you're going to go in, you're going to set your max version and, or say, keep it to the latest. Whatever the latest is, go and do that as soon as it's available to the device and the device sees it. For macOS, there's a little bit more granularity on top of that. You can also say, how do you want that to install? Whereas iOS, iPadOS, and tvOS, they're just going to prompt the user very similar to how you get it on your personal device. Do you want to do this when I plug it into power at night, etc. Well, with macOS, there's a little bit more. You could have it install with the default option where it's going to give a countdown on the device, install later where it's going to ask the user up in Notification Center in the upper corner, do you want to install this now? You can also pick a drop down of a deferral. That's a value that we, as an MDM, can pass the device using that protocol to say, give this device X number of times that they can defer it before it's going to go ahead, count down, and do that install. So that's how it is for setting the settings, but how does that work with inheritance? Because obviously you're going to have parent and child policies, different areas of your organizations that might have different needs. Well, what it boils down to is the most restrictive schedule and OS settings available to the device will be used. Meaning, so if you have a parent policy that's set to say, go to the latest, organization-wide, I just want to have that as a good security posture, great. But you have one department that has a child policy within that, and they can't go to the latest version because they have some software that isn't ready to utilize 13.3.1 or 13.4, whatever the next version is. You'd hold it back and say, well, that child policy have a maximum version. So that most restrictive that's available to those devices will take effect there. Same thing kind of for the scheduling. There's also the option of when it's going to give the device that time to run it. So that's going to happen, around 2 a.m. device time is the default schedule. Most restrictive for that would be calculated by the total number of hours. So, in this example I have on screen here, you're going to see, Sunday, Thursday, Saturday. Maybe you have a child policy or an area of the organization that they need the devices at 2 a.m. on Thursday for some reason, and you don't want it to run there. So you're going to uncheck that for that child policy. That will then restrict the number of hours that device can get that update pushed out to it. So last thing on the system updates is the requirements and different things that we've seen around that, and information there is basically it has to be supervised. That's how it's getting that trust basically as an MDM provider to push that out. Apple saying, okay, this trusted MDM enrollment, you can go and install these updates. Need to be on macOS 12 and newer. Device needs to be automated device enrolled or formerly DEP enrolled, or have that reduced security mode. This is one piece of nuance that we've actually been working with Apple on the back end. There's documentation that states that reduced security mode is needed on the silicon devices, but also at the same time documentation that's stating that for those that are MDM enrolled with ADE and supervised, it does not need to be there. And we're working with Apple on that with some feedback and some logging around that. iOS 9 and newer needs to have the base OS so you can use the updates, iPad OS 13 and newer, and tvOS 12 and newer. So now I'm going to pass it off to Joel, and he's going to talk a little bit about how you can utilize flex policies with the settings and the scheduling that I just talked about in the product.
All right, let's do it. Let me take the screen there, Bryce. We should be good. All right, so I was gonna record this, but in the spirit of sudo talks, we will be doing some live cooking here. I do want to start by saying that you do need the flex feature. We will be using that in this short demo. So if you don't have that feature enabled, you can navigate to your account integrations page. Just make sure you have that flex policies feature turned on. The flex policy feature is going to allow you to have multiple, add a device to multiple policies. It's also going to let you use the auto assignment feature, which allows you to create a set of conditions They'll automatically pull devices into a policy, and you could also unassign them automatically as well. And I'll be showing you how to use that today to get your system updates out. So we'll start by jumping into our policies page. We'll create a new policy. In this case, let's say we want to upgrade all our devices to Ventura. So we'll just call it macOS Ventura. Upgrade. And then we'll keep those organized and just drop it as a child of system updates. So Bryce did go through a lot of these settings here, but the first thing you're going to want to do is go into the update section. So just so you guys have an idea of where this is on the platform. Left-hand side here on the policy view, updates, and then you're going to enable macOS updates. So let's say we didn't want our devices to upgrade to Ventura. We could say something like 12.99.99 and set that as the maximum version. And what this is going to do is that it's going to make sure that the devices do not do that major upgrade. We do recommend keeping your devices up to date to the latest OS version. This is also what Apple recommends. It's going to keep your devices in the most secure state, as Apple's not going to go back versions and update those. You're just going to have to stay up to date with the latest. I know this is not ideal for most organizations, but this is what we recommend. But setting it up is pretty simple. Sometimes the difficult part is actually finding all the devices that need that update. And this is where we get to use the auto assignment feature. So you'll go into the overview and then press auto assignment. And then from here, we could start creating conditions to pull in devices that meet those conditions. So we do have a community fact called macOS Ventura support. And what this is going to do, it's actually just going to check if that device is able to upgrade to Ventura, regardless of what operating system it is. It's going to look at a few different facts. And if that's true, then we could automatically pull those devices right into this policy. If this is something that you're interested in using, it's available in our community section. So you just jump over into community, device facts. You could type Ventura, and then you'll see that pop up. And I think we also support a few other operating systems here as well, like Monterey. So do check that out. And there's probably a lot of other useful device facts and scripts that you could leverage from the community. So let's say we didn't want to use that device fact. The first thing we'll want to do here is really scope down which devices we want to affect. We know many of you manage multiple businesses in a single Addigy organization because of Addigy's powerful multi-tenancy tools, but you also have to be careful. So the first thing I always recommend is adding a policy ID condition. And with this, we could actually scope it down to only pull devices from specific device groups. So in this case, we only want devices that are in the Addigy company and MSP customer 1, 2, and 3. So what this does is that now we only get devices from those specific groups. The next thing we might want to do is actually check the OS version. And we might want to say, get me all the devices that are Monterey, because we want to upgrade all of them to Ventura. So we'll actually use this wildcard operator. We could say 12 dot in the wildcard. And that's actually going to pull in every device that's currently on Monterey within these policies. We could test this filter by pressing the test filter button. And then if we click 3 devices or view matching devices, it's going to tell us all the devices that met those conditions. So as soon as we save this auto assignment and those devices do an audit, they're going to automatically be added into this policy, and they're going to start receiving those updates that we configured earlier. So we could take this even further by also doing exclusions. Say there's a specific device in there, maybe a CEO's device that you don't want to have to force an update on. You could actually set up a serial number here and say does not contain, and then put that serial number in there. What that's going to do is that if that device meets these top 2 conditions, but it has this serial number, it won't get added into this policy, and therefore it won't receive the updates. Additionally, instead of selecting which device groups you want to include in this policy, you could do kind of like the inverse and say, give me everything except these groups. So in this case, I'll say, give me everything except the devices that are in the Addigy company. And that's another way that you could exclude devices in there. So This is how you could use auto assignment to reduce the workload of having to manually find all those devices and add them into a policy to get the upgrade. You can basically configure this to pull those devices automatically. And once they do hit that upgrade, you could actually remove them from this policy automatically as well by using the unassigned devices that no longer match this filter. So that's how you could use Flex to kind of enhance your system updates update process. So thank you, Bryce. And now back to you.
Thanks, Joel. Let me reshare here. Sorry, I was in the question and answer. Okay. So now that we know how we can push those settings out, or we can use Flex to adapt that on the fly based off of the information we're getting, how do we know if the updates are having issues or if the device itself, because it might not just be updates, it could be other MDM communication profiles, etc. So there's a number of device facts that are now in the product, kind of the work that's been taking place over the last few weeks and the last month or so of better understanding why this might be getting stuck or what's taking place on device. A couple different things we can look at, and that Ponce and I will be getting into here is there's a few facts. Last connected is looking at the last date timestamp we had communication. Is the client stuck is actually pooling a few things together that after we kind of go through the product, I'll talk a little bit about there. The certificate for identity, the MDM identity certificate, that needs to be there. Is the software update daemon stuck? Then what we're talking about was the secure boot level and privileged MDM and updated eligibility. There's device facts out there that are looking at those components on device. So, you know, does it have that state? Is it going to allow for that update to take place? And lastly, no one likes to hear it, but uptime. You know, and that's kind of one of the things we'll come back to with how the MDM client is stuck functions. Really what we're doing effectively with that and the MDM watchdog, which we're going to talk about in a flow chart in just a little bit, we're bouncing those services. And where we've seen high correlation to these updates not taking place or acknowledging it and just kind of hanging out there, and we'll see the software update catalog attempting to download, but then hanging. It's when the device has been on for a long time. So a lot more to that, but we'll get into that in the product here. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ponce here.
Thank you, Bryce. Let me share my screen and get started. I believe everybody can see my screen now. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you, Bryce. So we've been answering a bunch of questions as they come through. Guys keep asking us questions. We might not get to them immediately, but we will get to them at the end. There's going to be a Q&A section at the end. Really quickly, I'm just going to show you kind of the first things we look at to determine why software updates might not be installing or MDM's just not responsive, things like that. So what we do is we usually come and create a table view. You know, I usually call it MDM updates or tracking system updates, something like that. And those facts that Bryce just called out are super important. We spent the last couple of months working on a few of them and building them out, like MDM client stuck, identity certificate installed, is MDM software update stuck, last connected MDM update eligibility, privileged MDM. Bryce also mentioned a very important one called uptime. And last but not least, we need to know what version these devices are on. So macOS X version. And I create this as a table view just so I can have a quick glance at kind of where these devices are at, which devices might be stuck, which ones might have software update stuck. So just to reiterate, if MDM client is stuck, nothing will work from an MDM perspective. So if you're working on something 6 months from now and you're like, why isn't this deploying? Definitely check out if this is stuck, because it could cause MDM configurations or profiles not to install, MDM commands not to run. If you're trying to wipe a device or lock a device or even use live desktop and enable remote management, that's not going to work. So definitely keep an eye out for, is MDM client stuck? Is MDM software update stuck? Now, we've talked a few times about how to remediate this, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, pretty much every MDM solution out here is struggling with the same problem and these same bugs that exist on the macOS operating system. So we wanted to make it easier for everybody, and we created this MDM Watchdog beta feature. So if you haven't started using this, you're probably going to want to, unless you're going to want to manually remediate this stuff yourself. And you can manually remediate, and Bryce is going to talk about that as well. But you're just going to want, in my opinion, the easiest path forward is enabling the MDM Watchdog beta. And what that's simply going to do is just watch the health of these processes, specifically MDM. Is MDM stuck? Is MDM software update stuck? And if it is stuck, then we're going to try and restart the process to try and fix that issue. Now, that necessarily might not fix every condition. There are conditions we know about, like if the user performed migration assistant, that will break MDM pre-Ventura, and, you know, presuming they click the right checkboxes in Ventura during the migration assistant. So those are very important. The identity certificate tries to attempt to confirm that. If they don't have the identity certificate, MDM is just not going to work in general. Another good fact is the last date MDM was connected. As you can see, all these devices were connected today, so we should be in a healthy state. So MDM update eligibility checks a few things, but mainly, is this device on macOS Monterey? Does it have, and this was a question in the chat that we saw earlier, does it have privileged MDM that we have here? Privileged MDM. There's another way to look at privileged MDM. It's called secure boot level. So you can see whether a device supports it, if it device is in full security or reduced security or even low security, but that's a process to get there. And uptimes, as Bryce mentioned, uptime is critical because we only know what we know about and what we found. That doesn't mean we've accounted for every single bug out there in macOS, but usually rebooting the machine will fix those hung processes. So if you see a machine that has a really large uptime and it's just stuck doing stuff, you might want to give it a kick. We have a community script and a maintenance to prompt the users for, you know, reboot after 7 days. Definitely recommend that if you're not using that, just to get the devices in a healthier state. That will probably fix other weird issues as well. So definitely create a table view. Use these facts. They'll help you identify them. Use the Watchdog beta. That is really going to help perform these updates. Now, someone asked really quickly, I'm just going to jump into a question here while I'm on this subject, is privileged MDM required? On macOS Ventura and Apple Silicon, yes. Meaning, does the device need to be in reduced security? As far as we've tested, yes, and reported to Apple, we don't know if that's a feature, but you know, it's something we're getting confirmation on. So definitely you want to check out these facts. You can manually remediate as well. I'm going to hand that over to Bryce now in just a second, and who can walk through kind of what that is and how to do it. You can copy them from the community and just run them on demands, just like this, and select the devices you want to kickstart, whether it's kickstart software updates or MDM. That's what our Watchdog is doing. So again, strongly recommend that you enable the Watchdog MDM beta. That's going to help you kind of automatically do this task instead of erroneously running it at your own discretion or at some predefined maintenance job. If you're going to do it through a maintenance, definitely do it before you do your system update schedule. That'll definitely kind of help clear things up, stuck processes right before you try and push the update. All right, just one more thing before I pass it over to Bryce. If there is a device that you're seeing not doing something and you're not sure why, or you're trying to troubleshoot why MDM is not per se running, like in this case, MDM is disabled, MDM updates isn't going to work. But if MDM is enabled and it's still not responding, you can always use live terminal, run sudo logstream, grep MDM client like this. And then run an MDM audit here, meaning just press refresh data or profile list audit, and it's going to tell you what MDM client is doing locally on the device. This might give you an exact error of the problem. In this case, MDM is not even a role, so not the greatest example, but it's one of the easiest ways to troubleshoot why a specific device might not be responding when you need it to respond. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bryce, and we'll talk more in the Q&A section.
Thanks, Ponce. I'm literally just finishing answering a Q&A question here. I'm just going to copy and paste it on my clipboard and close the tab. Okay. All right, thanks for that, Hans. So now we know how we can go and find those pieces within the device facts. And we talked a little bit about what each of those components is looking at, but just more in depth, that last connected is, again, looking at that last 30 minutes of when the device is online. I think there was a Q&A, maybe I had typed an answer back to it, kind of a blur, a lot of questions. But the fact is basically saying, okay, I know that the device is online and it should, from an agent-based point, I know that the device is online. Do I have an MDM date timestamp in the last 30 minutes? The MDM client is stuck. We've seen it where it will get stuck after executing the OS update scan command. Some correlation around there. So we're looking for the logging and the information around that. The unknown but unresponsive state. We know that the device is on, it has the identity certificate, has all the different components that we're talking about here, but it's not communicated. We know that. So we know, okay, it's stuck for an unknown reason. And the MDM watchdog beta that we're talking about here, that's going to go take action on that. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The identity certificate, the Addigy MDM identity certificate is present in the system keychain of the device. If that's missing, that communication is not going to be possible. Maybe you have the keychain was removed, deleted. Maybe that item was removed. So other things might be there, but that's not something that that fact is going to go and check for. The MDM software update stuck. So that's actually looking at the software update D, the software update daemon itself. Looking at that process, is that responding? Are we seeing logging and information coming through for that? Then of course, the ones just actually looking for, is it eligible? Does it have the secure boot level set? Yes or no? And the uptime of it is another thing to very closely watch, because again, what are all these other components doing? It's really kind of around that uptime and bouncing those services. So manual remediation. Pass that. Let me pass that back to Ponce here.
All right. So we've been answering a bunch of questions here. So I know we brought up a few topics. I'm just going to reiterate privileged MDM or the security utility, the startup security utility, secure boot level. It's got like 12 different names at this point. It only applies to Apple Silicon. So if the devices are Intel, it's not applicable. Don't even worry about it. But if the devices are Apple Silicon, you will need to worry about it. More specifically on macOS Ventura is what we've seen, meaning macOS Ventura, you can try to do the updates, but on full security mode, it's not going to work unless you reduce the security of the device. If you're not sure how to do that, we actually have a KB article, but it does require going into the recovery partition and flipping a flag, which is not the best kind of experience for an end user. And there's no, unfortunately, Apple has not given a way to programmatically do this or script this out. And what we're talking about is this warning right here that you see when you enroll a device manually through MDM. Now there's some conflicting documentation. We're trying to get it all confirmed by Apple, whether this is by design or not. But at the end of the day, prior to Ventura, you could still deploy the update, but on Ventura, Apple Silicon, you do need to reduce the security. You go in here. We've actually seen where this just radio button is checked and not these checkboxes, and it seemingly still does it. Yeah, that's essentially what that is for and why we're doing that. Now, if you do see devices where MDM is stuck, what you can do is you can actually go to community scripts. You can copy down this restart MDM client service, as you see here, and then the software update, Kickstart software update, as you see here from Ignacio from the community team. You can copy these both down. I already have them in my instance here. So you can actually just come into the maintenance if you wanted to and create like a weekly Kickstart job if you want. And restart MDM and Kickstart software updates. And then you can set it at a schedule that aligns with your software update schedule, meaning if you're only doing it once a week, do it right before that one time a week. Or if you're doing it every day, do it right before that deployment window of that day. This is to manually remediate with a maintenance job, meaning this maintenance job will run at your discretion that you define here. You can always just run it on demand should you need to, just by selecting the devices that you want to run it on and running it from here. And you can press send, it's going to run that job, and you'll see the real-time results here through the history page. So a couple ways to kind of skin the cat, if you will. Now, you don't have to do any of these if you enable the MDM watchdog. So what a lot of other vendors are saying are just run these scripts at your discretion. What we did was we built a feature for you guys to do this automatically, so you don't have to worry about this. And that would be, again, my recommendation to so you're not running this out of band or running it kind of willy-nilly, if you will. Apple put out some warnings, like you shouldn't just randomly run this, right? You should look and see if a device is stuck and then try and run it. Well, that's easier said than done, and why we built this feature, so that you guys don't have to worry about all that stuff. So a couple different ways. You can also set up a monitoring item, as shown here, where you could just say, you know, is MDM stuck? And if it's true, run a remediation script that unsticks the MDM client, if that makes sense. Now, the problem with the MDM monitoring item is that monitoring items can, depending on the remediation results, may either leave the alarm open or not, which may mean someone has to action on them. Either way, I would just recommend the MDM watchdog, because there's, again, a couple ways to do this, but our recommended mechanism is this, and we can keep improving on this. And as we identify new reasons why MDM will get stuck or things will stop working, we'll add them to this watchdog feature, so you don't even need to worry about them. You know, if we change our community scripts, you have to update the community scripts or copy down the latest changes and make sure you're using them. So that is how you manually remediate versus the automatic remediation. And with that, I'm gonna take a break here and pass it over to Bryce. Are we ready to go on the next section, Bryce?
Yes.
And we're answering the questions as fast as we can here. There's going to be, again, there's going to be a Q&A section at the end that we'll, if we didn't get to them or there's more topics we want to cover in depth. I know there's a lot of questions about security modes and RSR, so we'll definitely get to that.
Yeah, and we'll be covering the RSR. It's kind of one of the last segments of this as well. So automating that, there's a couple different things we can do. Well, actually, this was actually just one question I was just about to answer in the Q&A here about the monitoring items. So if we hop into a policy itself, or we'll go into our catalog and we'll say, okay, I got monitoring items here. I had made one earlier, but around MDM stuck, and I go and edit that. I just gave it a name, MDM stuck. And what I'm looking at is MDM client stuck fact. And I'm looking at, is that true? Meaning, is the client stuck? Yes. Okay. Well, what are we doing then? Well, hey, let's send an email. So by sending a notification on that, we're going to know whenever a device falls into that state, because that's going to help investigate or troubleshoot why that is, because you'll know as soon as that device falls into that state. So give or take, it should be within 30, 40 minutes to an hour of when the device is online and that happens. You're going to know when that takes place on the device, because that last connected is going to be part of that calculation. It's going to look at that. So you'll know, okay, this device is stuck. And if you're trying to troubleshoot updates later, you'll know, okay, that device was that one. Let's zero in on it. What can we do for remediation? Well, you could, if you don't have the remediation turned on here, go and say, well, I want to, have the device go through and have the remediation. I just need to clear this out here. Have the remediation run by going in on the device, rebooting it, and doing something on it manually. Or what you could do is you could actually go and say, I want to run the watchdog, but I want to run a Diet Coke version of it. So having the watchdog enabled, like we've been talking about, and we'll be talking about that as the next very section, you could also run it just as a command, because this is part of the watchdog that's on all Addigy enrolled devices. So there's a command that's within watchdog --MDM auto heal. And this is effectively going and running what's happening during that audit on the device when that's checking in. So having this monitoring item run for policy would be a way to have that feature running that's going to say, okay, I want these devices that have this monitoring item assigned within this policy. If I see them get stuck, go and run watchdog on them. And you'll also get an email of it. So you'll know, hey, this device got stuck. And then the monitoring item, enabled that remediation, went out and ran that run with the watchdog. And you can go and check, is that device active again now? Just kind of one way to automate it while still using watchdog and having that, zoomed in, so to say, to one policy specifically. So what does watchdog actually do when you have it on for the entire organization? What is that functioning? So bottom line is you have your macOS client and you have it communicating, updating, upgrading, great. Everything's happy. How is that happening? Well, that's happening through MDM client and the software update daemon. So software update daemon and that are talking to Apple and the Apple push network. They're getting commands, they're executing, they're telling macOS to go and do an installation for this product key or this MDM profile. That's how that communication is all taking place. So what's happening when it gets stuck then, and how this is healing it, is the agent and watchdog, when it's getting that device audit, it's going in, it's saying, can I see, is this fact that's looking at the identity certificate, the uptime of the device, the last date time stamp, and we're looking for those pieces and logging around the OS update commands that have come down. Is the device getting stuck in that scenario? If it is, go ahead, bounce MDM client and software update daemon. That's going to get you to a state then where those might start responding again. In most cases, it works perfectly fine and they're functioning again, and that device will start running those updates and getting that MDM communication again. So last thing we'll talk about then is the rapid security response updates. If you're living under a rock in the last few weeks, you might not know this has come out from Apple, but it's been a very hot topic. Back on May 2nd, Apple dropped 13.3.1a for macOS, 16.4.1 for iOS and iPadOS. And what that is effectively doing is it's having an additional update on top of that base OS. This is something that Apple first talked about at WWDC in 2022. And you need to be on that base OS. So in the example we were talking about earlier with your maximum OS settings in the product, where you're actually configuring and saying, I want to have my devices on 13.3.0. I don't want to go to 13.3.1. That means they're not going to get the RSR update. Then you need to be on that base OS to have that installed on the device. This can be reverted on the device. Fun fact, if you're actually testing or trying to better understand how that deploys on the devices and what that looks like. If you had a device that's on 13.3.1 and you push out a policy using the system updates via MDM, that will go and push to the device, it will install it. And if you wanted to, you could take it off and push it out again. One thing to note, those updates are actually quite small, only 50 to 125 megabytes compared to a normal, couple gig installer for a macOS update. And that's because those RSR updates are only patching portions of the OS, if not only standalone binaries, different things, maybe like a shell vulnerability that was out there a couple of years back for macOS. They can now go in and do some of those things, as the name states, much sooner. And then that's going to be designated with the letter A, B, C for that version. If another update comes out for 13.4 macOS, well, that RSR, it's not going to be B for the next one. It would be starting over again for that from that base OS of it. So obviously, if you go out and have your device that you have personally that might not be in an MDM, you're going to see that update came out within a couple of days of that May 2nd drop. The good news is, as far as the policy that settings I was just talking about there are concerned, if you have it set to go to the latest version, whenever that comes out, you would have seen these go out to the devices, because when we got that available updates command from the device, that device then was saying, I have a newer version of iOS, iPadOS, macOS available. And then Addigy was going and saying, okay, there's a new version. This is the product key for it. Go and install that. So that command went out to those devices. They would have updated to it automatically when that schedule or the cron at the 2 a.m. time window, if they're just using the default schedule, was taking place. That update would go out, see that it needs to be done, and go and install it to the device then. So that's just really quick, some information on the RSR updates. More to come on that as Apple maybe utilizes this again. We'll see. It sounds like 13.4 is getting quite close to dropping, so we'll probably maybe have one later when 13.4 comes out if there's a need for it. One thing of note, there is a KB article out here, link on screen. I'll also be sending the link as well as a few other follow-up links for different KB articles that we've discussed here today, and also a form for any future sudo talk suggestions when we're done with the session, when we get to Q&A here in just a second. Otherwise, there is a QR on screen. This has some information going through the ins and outs of the deployment of them and actually looking at the status of them in the portal itself. I'll leave this on screen for a second here while I'm getting my clipboard ready to paste the links here. Okay, with that, we'll get on to Q&A. I'm going to put the links in chat here so everybody can get that. Everyone. Okay, that should be in the Zoom chat for everybody. If you want to get any of those links or anything that we just talked about, those are all there in the WebEx or the Zoom chat. All right, back to Q&A.
Bryce,
So if you have any questions,
I'd like to maybe answer a couple of things that, like, I've seen a couple of questions coming already, and just talk with the audience here. Maybe they can attest to what we've seen. I'm going to share my screen for just a second, if that's okay with you. So I hope we can see the right screen.
yeah, you're seeing your Mac Mini there.
Okay, perfect. Okay. It looks like they can't copy from the Zoom chat either. We'll have to work that out, but we'll figure it out, guys.
We'll make sure it's in the follow-up information with the recording.
Thank you, Brad. So a lot of people has asked about like notifications, and you just keep seeing like required managed updates when there isn't one, or getting prompted to do an update and never really enforcing it. A lot of those reports we have seen and we can attest to usually come down to the option install later. This option was introduced in macOS Monterey, and because of that, it seems like it still has some issues to work out. So we have reported these issues, specifically the device being on the latest OS, but with the install later flag is still prompting them to do an update, or it says they need to connect and they have less than 50% battery, a bunch of different erroneous prompts, even when they are on the latest build of macOS. This was reported to Apple through a feedback, and they let us know in macOS 13.4, they may perform some things to make install later more reliable. Now, they wouldn't give us more details on that. And for the sake of, confirming that it's fixed, we need to wait until 13.4 is released. The devices need to be on 13.4. And then when 13.5 is released, presuming 13.5 is the next one, we should be able to attest if that is more reliable or not. With that said, because of that, we usually recommend the default option. And I forget who was specifically referring to it, but the default option has its own kind of workflow, if you will, where it prompts the user for 60 seconds and then tries to do the update. It doesn't force the update if there's an application open like Chrome or something with unsaved changes, Chrome, Google Docs, Microsoft Word, something like that. If that is open, it will not force shut down the machine. So that means that the update might be waiting for the user when they are back up their machine and they close the application, and then it will perform the update. But this is probably, if you're more interested in getting the devices up to date, default is the best option. If you're okay with the devices not being up to date, install later is the less heavy-handed approach. Install with forced restart is the most heavy-handed approach. It may result in data loss because it's going to force shut down and restart the device to do the update. If you have any unsaved changes or the user has any unsaved work, they're going to lose it. So that's why we recommend the default option. And it's the easiest way to kind of make sure the devices are getting up to date, because usually if you allow the user to defer, they're going to defer until they can't defer anymore. That's just usually what most end users do, just, generally speaking. So If you ask us what the recommended practice is, it's keep the devices at the latest OS and use the option default. Why the latest OS? Well, because Apple has stated they're not fixing a lot of things in previous operating system, including Monterey. So if you want the most secure OS with the latest security fixes, it will be the latest build of the latest OS. In this case, it's Ventura. So this is our recommendation of kind of the best path forward at this time. Now, install later may be more reliable in 13.4, but none of our devices are on 13.4 except for, you know, the people brave enough to run the betas at this point, which is the current beta. So, you know, it's the most reliable at this point is what we're going to say. Bryson, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and
There's
one
any
thing of
questions?
note, yeah, actually, one thing on that topic about the install force restart, about it being heavy-handed, that has been one thing that's come up in some conversations with, is, you know, we talk best practices, obviously, keep devices updated and default as the best option. That said, though, if you have devices that are lingering, that were stuck, and you got them unstuck, you got them reporting again, there have been some instances where they'll make another policy or use Flex, and they'll say for, you know, this group of devices and this policy, go and have a different stance. I warned the users that, you know, they need to go and update, go and apply the update at a force reboot. So there's a couple different ways to get the devices up to that latest, and then, you know, going forward with 13.4 and up, hopefully that prompting actually is much more reliable for the end user experience, and they see that at notification center.
A couple good questions on this specific setting. So before we change subjects here, if we use this, keep it on the latest OS, we'll go to a beta build. It should not, unless the device is enrolled in the Appleseed program, at which point it should not go to a beta build. If it is enrolled in Appleseed, it would not go to the beta. If it is not enrolled in Appleseed, it should not go to the beta. And Ross was a great question here. Does this setting respect deferrals? You know, I've seen it go both ways. I know if you look at this, I'm running out of space here. If you run out of space, then you can't do an MDM update, that's for sure. But I think Bryce may have took that question already. But if the device has a restriction for 90 days, it may impact us seeing the update to deploy the update. But if you pass the update, it should still install the update, because I think MDM updates, regardless of the restriction, will try and install if you pass that explicit update command.
Correct.
Yeah. Now,
And
go ahead, Bryce.
I was gonna say, and another thing to keep in mind is that it will inhibit it from running on the device there, and the user wouldn't see that in system preferences. But again, if they go and find that out, or sorry, if the MDM goes and sends that command out, it is going to take place, because that product key is going to get passed. So that available update is going to take place and the schedule is going to take place.
Yep, exactly. One thing we haven't discussed that, you know, like, well, all right, so we haven't discussed this, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're ever trying to deploy an update, you can press start system updates, but the way we design the start system updates mechanism is it's not going to requeue an update if we perceive an update is already running. Now, because of the macOS system updates and MDM client unresponsiveness, and sometimes like you send an update and it just goes into the wind, if you will, it might get stuck and never try again or do something along those lines. So if you really want to try and deploy an update, you can always just come in here, go to updates, and see if you can deploy the update and try and deploy it through this go live updates mechanism. This is the way of doing it per device, if you will, versus the policy mechanism. Now, if you do this mechanism here, it kind of goes back to the point of like, if you have a restrictions profile, it might prevent us from actually seeing the update here. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. One question I want to answer live here, if you, since you're sharing the screen, if you pop back to the policies and the settings about the deprecated tag. So the macOS updates deprecated tag that you were seeing when we're in the policy update settings, that's for that old binary base. So like in the very first part of the sudo talk, we were talking about how Apple's been moving towards MDM commands. That tab you're effectively seeing there, that's the old binary based one where we were actually going and kicking it off using the software update binary on device itself. And that's where we're not getting some of those things for the newer platforms and what Apple's going to be pushing towards in the future, even with things we don't know about with silicon, if there's any other extra layers of security, having that come from the trusted MDM as the channel versus having it come from, I mean, still in theory with that, it's coming from the MDM, but the device is none the wiser because it's being run from the binary on device. It thinks it's actually from that command prompt. So like authenticated reboot, different things like that. Those, as those become more advanced going forward, or if those options change or something happens with silicon or whatever's after silicon, it's going to need to come through that MDM channel. So that's why it shows deprecated. It is still there and functional for the older versions of macOS, but for the newer versions, macOS 12 and up, this is going to be the route to do those updates.
All right, so a couple more questions here. Is there a specific setting for RSRs to deploy? There is not. It's just encompassed as part of the system update build. So if you keep devices at the latest OS or your maximum version is 13.3.1 or higher, it's just going to automatically try and deploy. You can also deploy it through go live updates if you wanted to. Like this. But essentially the RSRs should just deploy automatically. It's not specific feature just for the RSRs. I see another question. Go live update doesn't seem to work even when choosing the forced update option. For an hour and longer, we have to manually reboot the machine. That actually sounds like MDM is stuck or something along those lines. What I will say is that the terminology is slightly different, and we're trying to make that a little bit better aligned. Just kind of more of the developer documentation at this window, but the default and or install mechanism is essentially equivalent to the default mechanism in the system. You can see here, this is actually showing two options because it's actually using our agent at this point. So when you go here, we try and use our agent when available to use the system updates binary on older operating systems. But if you go to the newer operating systems, we're going to show and perform them through MDM because that's the only path forward. How does not? Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to answer real quick. The default behavior, the clarification is it does give that 60-second countdown with the notification center. And like Ponce was talking about, like if they have open work, it's not going to go ahead and do that. One thing to keep in mind, the user can click on that notification and halt that if they have something going on there. And then that would just kick off again at the next run window of that update.
Yes, exactly. So the default option does prompt the user. It gives them 60 seconds to either defer or install. Should they not action on it, it's just going to try and force the update if possible. Someone asked, how can I delay the number of days for a user to see updates? That's in the restrictions payload under software updates. You can include these keys, delay user visibility of software updates, and major macOS Ventura updates. So you can defer up to 90 days of that release. At this point, it's really hard to prevent people from seeing Ventura. And honestly, you probably should push them towards Ventura if possible, unless there's some breaking change. One of the nice things about RSR updates is that you can actually revert them. So if an RSR update gets pushed out to one of your devices and it causes some breaking change, you can actually revert back the update, which is a nice thing. They're using that snapshot mechanism. That's part of the reason why RSR updates deploy much easier and are much more successful in deploying than some of the historic system updates we have had, because it doesn't require all the rigmarole the normal update process does. How does RSR fit into a 99.99.99 macOS version? Well, it should just encompass it, essentially. It should just deploy it out when it sees that 99.99.99 is here like that. That makes sense.
I'm going to answer this one. I'm going to answer this one live then. The best way to do the unattended updates kind of depends on what you're looking for results there. Again, we would probably say keep devices updated and default. That way, at least if there is an end user on the device, they're going to get that interaction. Otherwise, like I was saying with that example of users using flex policy and saying this group of devices has to update. I don't care. I want it to go as soon as the device can do it. That's going to be the force reboot, and it's going to do it as soon as it gets the command and the device executes that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. If you guys are seeing that you're having trouble doing system updates, I'm gonna reassure you all that that is a problem across all vendors, and why we've kind of put together this webinar and built all these features to kind of make MDM more reliable, so that when software updates do process, they work the way we intend them to do. But if you guys are, after this webinar, you're still confused, still have questions, definitely submit a ticket. We can set up a time or just walk you through whatever you might be experiencing, or if it's something new, we can submit it to Apple as Apple feedback. But
Yeah,
there's a lot of new stuff. Yeah.
I was going to say one thing I want to add to that about submitting that to Apple. This is an open dialogue, something that we're still working on the back end here. We want to make the process better across the board, and that requires, if you have any of those scenarios that we haven't accounted for, like actually, there's one I wanted to say earlier when you were talking, Ponce, but I didn't want to cut you off on about, we were seeing Mac minis that would say the battery needs to be above 50%, which with the example for 13.4. A Mac mini doesn't have a battery. So any of those different scenarios that we can encompass and get the right information and logging to Apple, they're just going to help the process be better for everybody.
Agreed. And we've been reporting a lot to Apple, and they're all over the software update issues. So if you're able to find something like that, get a sysdiagnose, that'll help us. If you haven't seen 13.3.1a or the RSR update, RSR, we shouldn't be using the acronym, is what I was told. Rapid security response is the right approach. Now, you can actually go to general macOS Ventura. I got a little Easter egg here where you can remove and restart the rapid security response build. It actually, I'll click it here and show you all kind of how that works. It will require a password. There's no programmatic way to remove this from an MDM. It just doesn't exist yet. Feedback was submitted to allow this to be programmatically removed. And the lights that it does become some sort of MDM command we can add to Addigy, so that you guys can do this remotely should you need to. But in the grand scheme of things, hopefully we're not removing fleets of emergency security fixes that we don't know what is encompassed in it. Removing that in bulk. You can prevent the users from doing this themselves. By default, it is enabled, and by default, they can install these RSRs themselves. If you want to restrict that, that's again MDM profiles. You come to the restrictions profile, and you'll see it here. You can either choose to allow them to install or not allow, and allow the removal or not allow the removal.
Yeah, the next two I'm going to kind of answer as there was a question about what terms of, in terms of logging, what are we looking at when we're trying to figure this out? Like when I've been submitting tickets to Apple, giving them a starting point of, hey, this is the time frame, this is what we're seeing in the logging, kind of deconstruct that process is very important. And then also to the other question about, we have Watchdog enabled, lots of devices that are still stuck. I would say again, logs from the device to try and figure out what's going on. Also, and not to sound like the trope from IT crowd, have you tried turning it off and on again? Because sometimes even the Watchdog can't get it to unstick. But that said, for both of those, as far as logging goes, sysdiagnose, if you're not familiar with it, the command sudo space sysdiagnose, all one word, all lowercase. That's actually going to go and generate an archive of logs on the macOS device and tell you, it's basically, if you're from the Windows world, it's like interactive command prompt in remote PC viewer, where you'd actually go in and look at the activity and events. It's going to make an archive. And within that archive, there's going to be a system log archive, .log archive file. It's going to be usually about 200, 300 to 400 megabytes. It's like a rolling log, catches about anywhere from 2 days to maybe a week, depending on how busy the device is. If the device is updating, it's going to be much busier, so you want to get it sooner rather than later. And those logs contain things like the software update daemon. So when we're actually filtering, we're filtering for that process. We're filtering for the MDM client process. So if you open those up in console, and there'll be a search bar in the upper corner, you can filter for it. It is incredibly slow because it's a lot of data, especially if you're on an Intel device, it's very, very slow. But that will show you kind of what's happening on device. And some of those are the components that we're looking through, because if you use the log binary, you can say log show and actually filter and look for those. So some of the things that we're doing with some of these facts with the agent is actually looking at and basically pulling that apart and seeing what are we seeing in the logs around that getting stuck. So the facts, turning those on and looking at those will help, as well as turning on Watchdog to basically utilize that automatically without any effort on your part there. But if you still do have them stuck, reboot, and also those logs will be critically important, and something that if we do start a dialogue with Apple on a feedback, that information will definitely be needed.
Yeah, another good approach is like when you push the update, kind of what I usually try and do is tail the install.log, var log install.log, because it's going to show you real time, like if it's downloading or if it's trying to install. Usually var log install log at that time, like we ask for the sysdiagnose because it could have happened historically. But if you're doing it real time and you want to just see what's going on, what we found is the var log install.log is the best way to determine what is going on those devices, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one sidebar I just thought about, I just put it in chat. I know you can't copy and paste, maybe you can open them, but we'll make sure the links are sent out as part of the package at the end with the recording. Sometimes we have seen devices get stuck with iOS. It's much, much, much more rare, but there is also a way to gather a sysdiagnose on iOS or iPadOS. That is on that link there. Basically, you can do it through a up, down, left, right button combination, or my preferred method. If you turn on assistive touch, you can go in and actually hit the analytics button. It will generate a sysdiagnose, and then you can airdrop that file from the iOS or iPadOS device to the macOS device.
All right.
The Q&A answers, I will find out if there's a way to export those, and we'll make sure to include that. I'll make a note for that right now. I know we're over time. You were going to say, Paul?
I was gonna try and ask, see if I can address one question here from Tim. If you're looking for a deferral profile that's out there, you should be able to run a command to determine that. If you're not sure, create a ticket, we can try and help you craft one that looks for that type of profile in the device.
And what I was going to say is, I know we're over time. I want to answer this one last question here about the go live updates. That's actually something that is being worked on in the product right now to basically pull that data and aggregate it. There's also something that we're working on right now for when you're in the policy settings itself. You could go look at the deployment status and see each of the devices within update of, okay, these devices are getting the new RSR update. This is the status of all of them. That'll be coming shortly. I actually was QA testing it earlier this morning, so that's on the horizon. Stay tuned for that. I think with that, thank you so much, everybody, for all your questions. If you have anything else, please do not hesitate to reach out. Like I said, it's an ongoing process that we want to continue improving this. And we really appreciate the feedback and all the time you guys put into coming today and hearing what we have to say. you.